Hello world, you're listening to Strategikon, your window to all things security and foreign affairs. It's been a while since we've been on air. There have been a number of things that have occupied us, all of which work-related. However, now that things have gone back to a more normal pace, we're back. On March 5th, 2018, former Russian spy Sergei Skripal and his daughter were critically injured after an alleged assassination attempt on them in a Salisbury Park in the United Kingdom. The assassination attempt was carried out by unknown assailants using a nerve agent that has now been linked to the Russian Federation by investigating authorities. British Prime Minister Theresa May and much of the UK Parliament were outraged by this audacious infringement of British sovereignty by what London now considers a flagrant Russian attack. Ironically, though, the investigation into the assassination attempt has only just gathered momentum, but the British government have already fingered the culprit, Russian President Vladimir Putin. Skripal settled in the UK in 2010 after a spy swap arrangement and after Skripal had served some 6 years out of a 13-year sentence for high treason once Russian authorities discovered that Skripal had been working as a double agent for the UK back in 2004. The reason that the British government came to the rapid conclusion that Russia was behind this attack was that the nerve agent used had the unmistakable fingerprint of Russian manufacture, Novichok, a nerve agent that had been manufactured in the Soviet Union between 1971 to 1991. Should the investigations underway continue to point to Moscow as the only likely culprit of this violation of British sovereignty, how will this play out? So far, the British have expelled 23 Russian diplomats from the UK. Russia has also been roundly condemned by the UK and its allies at the United Nations in spite of Russian protestations of innocence. This is all the hallmarks of another less than subtle murder at the hands of Russian interests, the death of former KGB spy who defected to the UK, Alexander Litvinenko. Litvinenko died in 2006 after having ingested tea laced with the highly toxic radioactive element, polonium-210. So, in an economically interdependent, nuclear-armed world, where war cannot be the response to what in days gone by would have elicited a strong military counter, what is the UK likely to do? Theresa May's government is weak, arguably made all the more so due to Brexit and its self-imposed isolation from the European Union. Transatlantic relations between the UK and the US are not what they used to be since Trump won office in 2016. And while the Trump administration quickly showed its support for the British position, how long will that last, considering Trump's fascination with Russian leader Putin and his complicated situation regarding the ongoing US investigation into Russian interference in the Trump presidential campaign? To quote the old classic movie The Wizard of Oz, Toto, I have a feeling we're not in Kansas anymore. To discuss this today, we are happy to have back on Strategikon Commodore Patrick J. Tyrrell, Royal Navy retired, and in the studio I'm joined by SIA's resident existentialist philosopher David Olney and SIA research assistant Ms. Shahrazad Ghairat. Before we start today's episode, I would like to remind listeners that Strategikon can be found on iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, TuneIn, YouTube, and on the Sage International Australia website, www.sageinternational.org.au. Hi Pat, welcome back to Strategikon.
Delighted to be here.
Okay, now we'll start off with Shahrazad. She'll bring our first question to the table. Shaz?
Hi Pat. So, Moscow's role with Britain remains diplomatic for the moment, with the two sides going tit for tat over the poisoning of Skripal and his daughter Yulia. The case has similarities to the killing of former Russian spy Alexander Litvinenko, who was poisoned with radioactive tea in London in 2006. One will imagine that when the first poison attack took place, Britain would have stood strong to make sure that history wouldn't repeat itself. However, to date, Britain's response to the Skripal attack has been soft. Theresa May announced that Britain would expel 23 Russian diplomats and potentially impose a freeze on Russian state assets after not getting a satisfactory response from Kremlin. Russia does not seem bothered by the diplomatic tone of the UK. My question is, apart from declaring war, what should Britain do if they are to eliminate these sorts of attacks on their soil?
Very good question. I think that first and foremost, you don't want to be a retired double agent of the KGB or the FSB living in the UK at the moment, because a disproportionate number of them seem to have suffered early deaths. They're now reviewing the deaths of a number of people that have been ruled as natural causes to see if indeed they have been subject to a violent end. I think that the UK has slight problems. I mean, Russia is the bully boy on the block. And when you listen to them denying all knowledge of this attack, just bear in mind that Russia invented Maskarovka and disinformation. But the United Kingdom is only a relatively small player on the world stage these days. And what the United Kingdom has to do is to bring in its allies in both the Five Eyes community, its allies in the EU, which we are, despite any evidence to the contrary, still members, and its allies in NATO. And it needs to be the West that takes a decisive statement against Russia. Probably the most decisive statement it could take would be if Germany, France, Spain, and the UK withdrew from the World Cup competition coming up this summer, because that would seriously upset the ruling clique in Russia. The other thing we could do, and we are looking to do again with our allies, is to attack the finances of the oligarchs who manage to squirrel away just obscene amounts of money in the course of doing their normal day's work in Russia. And these have tended to be, in the main, secreted in the UK. They bought large numbers of properties. They invest in a large number of things, not least Chelsea Football Club. And action needs to be taken against those oligarchs who actually support Putin and maintain his particular power base, to cut back on their freedom of action. So there are a number of different things we can do. I think that you mentioned Litvinenko. We were very poor at reacting to Russia with Litvinenko. I think that we're going to be more robust here. And if further evidence comes out of Russian collusion, the Russians will continue to deny it, but hopefully the rest of the world will get to see the evidence and will be able to make up its own mind.
Pat, a few things I'd like to sort of pick up on there and get your response to. I absolutely agree that the best thing that allies could do is en masse, say no to, major sporting events, over the next year, 18 months, however long, to make the point. You behave like this and we'll deny your credibility in other arenas. In terms of the oligarchs and the billionaires, could we read it another way, that what we really saw was a mid-level double agent being taken out to remind them to behave? So rather than coming down hard on the Russian oligarchs in the UK, we have to wonder, what is it that one of them was going to do that the Russian regime took out a nobody?
Well, that's an interesting way of looking at it. I think that the Russians never do anything without good reason. I think it was Metternich who was woken up during the Congress of Vienna in 1817 to be told that the Russian ambassador had died in his sleep. And his first comment was, "I wonder why he's done that." Yeah. There There's a reason behind all these things, and many of them, you're right. I mean, you only have to look at, that Russian toy, the doll. I mean, it's a doll within a doll within a doll within a doll, and so here we have, that there's an overt reason, and then there are other reasons that come in, nesting like these dolls, and. So I think that undoubtedly Putin wants to make sure that, in this country we have a number of Russians who are Putin-esque and have large amounts of money and live independent, wealthy, billionaire lifestyles. And then we have a number of other Russians who are exiles. And I think that when Putin sends out a message, he will address each of these communities in turn. And killing, or I mean, they're not dead, but, potentially killing attempted murder in Salisbury is one way of reminding them of the long arm of the Russian state.
Okay, Pat, in terms of being as fair as possible, I must weigh in to play devil's advocate, because there's been a lot of other things countervailing philosophies with regard to the whole Skripal thing. One of them is there a degree of Russophobia in the UK that is partially responsible for the quick judgment of Russian guilt for this episode? I mean, after all said and done, the investigations have not concluded. I mean, they're still ongoing, they're still very new, and before we actually start casting Russia as the bad guy, is it not better to have the evidence before us before we actually start putting a country like Russia in our crosshairs?
Well, let's start from the basic facts. The target of this attack were Russians, and in particular one Russian, who had been sentenced to death in Russia. The means of the attack was undoubtedly a nerve agent called Novichok. This nerve agent, although it's never been admitted by Russia, we know was manufactured in Russia in a program in the 80s and the 90s. We know that. Why? Because we had a defector who came and produced ample evidence of the program. Nerve agents aren't things you can go and buy at your local pharmacy. They tend to be developed by states, and they have to be, I have to say, states with a highly effective scientific base, because these things are, as you might expect, dangerous. So we have something that tends to be manufactured by states, and Theresa May, of course, said in her original announcement, either it was a deliberate attack or the Russian state has lost control of nerve agents. It either lost control, some years ago, or it's lost control recently. But at some point, its procedures have been so lax that somebody, a third party, has managed to get hold of these. Now, if a third party has been holding it for 10 or 15 years, nerve agents don't have a infinite lifespan. They have to be kept incredibly carefully, and they don't get moved easily. Now, when you bring all these things together, it requires a certain degree of sophistication, which in itself points to a state apparatus of some sort. I think Theresa May was too outspoken in her attack on Russia. The only one I'd question is Williamson, who came up with his rather crass statement on Russia to go away and shut up, which I think is a measure of his immaturity in the diplomatic field.
With all the ways that enemies of the state can be dispatched without leaving obvious traces, such as orchestrated traffic accidents, orchestrated fatal muggings, more subtle poisonings, why would Putin expose himself and his country to even more Western approbation and potential sanctions? I mean, what's in it for him?
Well, I think that you have to look at the way Russia itself works. You know, if this was to happen in Russia, you know, some chap and his daughter would be found on a bench frothing at the mouth, and people would say, oh dear, they must have eaten something that disagreed with them. It's only because there is a due process that goes through, and we Brits are highly suspicious that, you know, this has really come out. I don't think that the Russians are particularly sophisticated in their dealings with these sorts of cases. And they assume that other people aren't going to be sophisticated as well. And, you know, there's a sense of, Putin says, you know, rid me of this turbulent priest, and, you know, people jump to it and do it by all sorts of strange means. And you can imagine them sitting around with a samovar of tea and a couple of glasses of vodka saying, well, this is a very good idea. And, you know, they don't necessarily think things through.
Pat, this idea of getting things done without necessarily thinking the long-term consequences. If Putin has got only 6 years left, unless he wants to change the constitution and, you know, do a Chinese example and have, you know, power for life, we're going to see a transition soon. So this seems logical that it could be people showing how capable they are. And to extend the idea of showing how capable they are, if the audience is not necessarily the oligarchs in London, who else do you think might be the relevant audience to pull their heads in and stop annoying the Russians?
Well, it is interesting that Putin's recent election, they're claiming about 76% majority. And in fact, a few weeks ago, they were saying, you know, the opposition, which is not a particularly strong opposition, and we know that, but the opposition was looking at between 50 and 60%. You know, there is no doubt in Russia that, you know, Russia has always liked a strong man. You know, the Tsar was venerated. You know, they still like Ivan the Terrible, who went round. I mean, he's not called Ivan the Terrible because he was a cuddly grandfather type figure. You know, they admire this power and this exercise of power, which of course has worked for Putin in the past. And, you know, Putin, by threatening Russia, by accusing Russia of these terrible things, you know, the Russians say to themselves, hey, we didn't do bad, did we? We can go into the UK and, you know, quite right, Father Putin is going to go and sort things out. So, you know, there's a domestic audience that may well have benefited from this sort of fracas. And it's like Putin going into the Crimea. I mean, the West cries foul, but they fail to understand that as far as Russia is concerned, you know, Sevastopol is a hero city. I mean, it was there in the Second World War. It was there at the beginning of the revolution. You know, Ukraine is where Rus started. You know, that's all part of this idea of being Russian. And therefore, going into the Ukraine, going into Crimea, knitted Russia together. Going after Russian enemies knits Russia together. So I think it's all one on the same sort of approach to international politics, where there is a focus, if you like, on the domestic issues as well.
Yeah, it's very much Tim Marshall's argument in his book about how maps and geography define what happens next, that when you have just got open plains on either side, you need to fight hard for spare space. And in a sense, causing harm in the UK is so far away, they're potentially leaving Europe, there are minimal consequences for you, you reinforce to your expat population in London to behave, and you make everyone worried every side of you that Russia is still a contender. So for, you know, a pretty small activity, it's a no-lose situation.
Yes, I would entirely agree with you. And you know, we're ascribing too much in terms of foreign policy to this, and not enough in terms of what it means domestically. What it means for Putin as the unquestioned leader of Russia, and indeed how effective he needs to be seen as the undisputed leader of Russia so that he can manage his own successor. He can make sure that he gets a successor who is not going to say, excuse me, Comrade Vladimir, you're going to be put up and arrested on corruption. That's the big worry. I mean, Putin has got the same worry that all strong leaders have, is when they come to the end of their time in power, there are all sorts of people who want to get even.
Well, here in Australia at the moment, we're waiting for the movie about Stalin's death, with Michael Palin in it, which has got rave reviews where people have seen it. And it's exactly that thing. When the Tsar dies, everyone looks at each other and goes, is there anyone I can rely on? So Putin is buying that last chunk of time and buying just a little chunk for his successor.
Yeah, I mean, but go back to the Tudor court in England, and it's exactly the same.
Yeah.
Exactly the same.
Yeah.
This is a natural human element where people have got power and influence, and then suddenly it looks as though that power and influence is going to wane.
So, Pat, what implications will this have on the relationship between the UK and the Russian Federation? Could this lead to another Cold War?
I'm not sure that it will necessarily lead to another Cold War. The Cold War was a very specific existence. I mean, it was called a Cold War. Churchill talked about barriers coming down across Europe. I think that as long as there continues to be an interaction between the general population, Russians going out of Russia for holidays, Britons going into Russia for study and for holidays, the Cold War will not be able to restart. I think it will cause a cold snap between the government of Russia and the British government for quite some time, and it will take some time for that to thaw, particularly given the nature of the British government and the Russian government. I mean, some would say that if the Labour Party wins the next election and Jeremy Corbyn comes in, he and Seamus Milne would want to see much closer relations with Russia. But I don't think it's going to lead to that Cold War feeling that we had in the 60s and the 70s.
Pat, I've put myself in the position of bad cop in this here, so forgive me. I have to ask this question. I hope you can answer it. Answer it in a full and frank manner. Now, look, there are those who have claimed that the attack on Skripal was a false flag operation, that it was either MI5 or MI6 or both that created this event to implicate the Russians. Plausible deniability protecting both British agencies from accusation, that the UK knows of some fatal flaw in Putin's overarching strategy, and Skripal is the sucker punch designed to make the Russians trip up, with Putin overplaying his weak hand. Could the British have acquired Novichok and deployed it in Salisbury?
Well, could they have acquired it? The answer is probably yes. Would they have deployed it in Salisbury? The answer is undoubtedly no. I mean, the damage that is done to MI5 and MI6 by having one of their double agents attacked is far worse than any advantage that could be gained. I mean, MI6 takes a degree of pride in being able to give new lives to people that have been working for it in other countries. That's, to some extent, is one of the advantages and one of the reasons why some people, I think, have defected towards MI6 rather than to, let's say, the CIA, is that they feel that at least they'll get treated, they'll have a decent life afterwards, assuming that they can be extracted. And, people like Gordievsky clearly were extracted at considerable risk, but are now living peaceful lives in the UK. And to have that upset by, losing former agents, and MI6 does seem to have been losing them rather quickly. It all tends to be the Russian elements that are going. I don't think that, MI6 would countenance that as a way of furthering some strange British government's view of how things might be. We would, I'm convinced, far rather work closely with Russia than be at odds with Russia. And it makes no sense for the United Kingdom, for a United Kingdom that is just about to come out of Europe, to start pissing people off, other countries, when we might want to be having more trade with Russia.
And now we'll take a short break with our musical interlude. You're listening to Strategikon, the podcast of SIA.
Putin зажигает как при революции. Ему скучно и страшно с людьми в тишине. Заикать на него, то гнилая рябина. Что не срок много лет, но предмет революции. Страна идет, на улице все растет. Страна идет, страна идет.
That was subversive Russian nasty girl punk band Pussy Riot singing their 2016 hit Putin Lights Up the Fires. And now we'll return to our discussion on the Skripal incident and its broader strategic implications.
It seems the most illogical thing at the moment that this could have the blowback of upsetting a Russian, UK relationship when the UK are going to be infinitely more dependent. And you would figure that normally the Russians would see an advantage to the UK leave Europe, and Russia has better relations with them. And in a sense, you bracket Europe between a militarily capable Russia and an economically capable UK because everyone put their money in it. So the idea of potentially unravelling that neither seems logical for the Russians or for the UK, which then makes the idea of even a Russian operation, it's about the Russian community, whether it be in the UK or Russia, or other potential enemies of Russia, far more than it's about the UK, it seems to me.
Oh, I think you're right. I mean, I think this is at whatever level you look at it, this is a Russian domestic operation that is played out on the soil of another country rather than being an attack on the United Kingdom.
In the UK, Prime Minister May's government seems to be a weak minority government, dependent as it is on the Conservative Party's partnership with the Northern Irish Democratic Unionist Party. But May came out swinging against Russia, which must have played well in both the media as well as the UK electorate. Will looking and sounding tough against a fully demonised Russian Federation buoy May's political prospects?
Yes, I think is the short answer. I think that any country, the people like to see their government acting in the interests of that country and being able to make a firm and steady commitment. And if you just look at the comparison between Theresa May and Jeremy Corbyn, who Jeremy Corbyn said, well, of course, we can't jump to conclusions and, it's all the fault of the government because we've reduced the money spent on diplomacy, and don't forget what happened about the dodgy dossier and Iraq, and was pushing a whole range of domestic issues rather than focusing on the attack itself. And, Jeremy Corbyn's ratings went way down, and Theresa May's ratings went right up. And so any leader that is faced with one of these situations, just like Margaret Thatcher in 1982, when the Argentinians invaded South Georgia and the Falkland Islands, another Prime Minister might have said, oh, well, that's a pity, we can't do anything about it. But Margaret Thatcher came out fighting. As a result, a rather mediocre Prime Minister was turned into something akin to Superwoman and won the following year's general election convincingly, and then remained in power for the rest of the decade.
With regard to Jeremy Corbyn, what do you think made him not jump onto the May government bandwagon? I mean, is it because of his hard leftist politics, or was he simply badly advised? And could this actually spell the end of Corbyn's leadership of the Labour Party?
I think that you have to understand that Jeremy Corbyn has never really changed. He's always been a bit of a rebel. He has always sided. He's one of these people who doesn't like the established West. And so anything that is against the established West, he feels is good. He's been doing this the whole of his political career. And indeed, for 90% of his political career, he was a complete non-entity. He wasn't rated at all in the Labour Party. And to some extent, he got nominated just as a placeholder. And then, of course, surprised everybody when a large number of young people thought, well, here's a person talking in a completely different way from the politicians that we've experienced. So it must be good and it must be, enlivening, and therefore we'll support him. But he is instinctively against anything that is seen by the West as being normal politics. He still thinks Chavez was the greatest chap since sliced bread, and Maduro is a poor, unfortunate, unrecognised great leader of Venezuela. He thinks that Russia has fought against the imperial West and should be supported. And it's going to, he's never going to change his mind. I mean, this was the milk at his mother's breast. This is stuff that's going to keep him going for the rest of his life.
So the fascinating thing here is we potentially have Theresa May really can't do much more than she can do about this. Corbyn wouldn't do anything even if he could. So it has a fascinating sort of flow-on effect that even if it's for a Russian audience, it shows the absolute ineptitude of the ability for either party in the UK to do anything constructive in response.
Yes, I mean, it's the archetypal between a rock and a hard place.
Yeah.
I think that tends to play into the strategic planning in Russia. I mean, it really felt that, here was a target that they could go, which was sufficiently removed to be almost deniable. And who cares less what happens in the United Kingdom? The United Kingdom is, as far as Russia is concerned, is irrelevant to them. And therefore, it's a risk worth taking.
And this is the incredible thing with Putin. He is fantastic at either making or finding vacuums and then positioning himself in them to go, aren't I Mr. Reasonable and Mr. Consistent, and don't I look after my people? So really, any opportunity to create a vacuum and then put something in it that everyone else wouldn't choose, it's power projection by default.
Yes, and when you couple this with the fact that, we know now that there are a number of troll factories in Russia which are producing literally thousands of tweets and bots and online comments which are sweeping and causing people to think in a different way. And we know they're being manufactured in Russia. They can only operate in Russia with at least the tacit agreement of the government. But as I said in my opening remarks, this harks back to Russia's love of disinformation. They've always worked. And it just happens that nowadays we have much better ways of passing fake news out.
So, Britain's alliance partners, the US, Canada, Germany, and Australia, are all supportive of Mrs. May's decision to evict 23 Russian diplomats from Britain. Is it wrong to assume that if Russia can attack its former spies in the UK with nerve agent, then the UK's allies may be vulnerable from such attacks too?
No, I think that's entirely right. I mean, if Russia is quite happy to have agents several times removed, I mean, you may delegate that requirement to go and commit murder to, down the line, so it could be criminal elements, but the mastermind is the Russian government. If they can do it in the UK, they can do it anywhere. And I think that they would probably think twice before doing it in France, because the French have a long-standing, very old relationship with Russia in terms of an alliance between France and Russia. And the French are very keen to maintain Russia as a place where they do business, and to actually do something on the streets of Paris, for example, might be seen as not being worthwhile to Putin. And again, they may think twice about doing it in Germany, but I think the principle is if they can do it in one place, they can do it anywhere else that they feel is worthwhile.
I find the whole notion of Vladimir Putin being the Teflon King of international relations quite amazing. I mean, is the fact that Putin commands some 4,300 nuclear warheads his ultimate deterrent? No Western country, unilaterally or collectively, would deliberately launch destabilization operations against the Kremlin for fear of loose nukes following the collapse of the central government in Moscow. Mind you, not knowing where Russia's tipping point is, heaping more economic sanctions onto Russia may well see the unexpected collapse of the central government at some stage, leading to the exact same outcome. But assuming that Putin is the cunning fox that everyone makes him out to be, and that his power base is secure, isn't he fully aware that short of war, the West has no way in which it could hurt him or curb his belligerent tendencies?
Yes and no. Yes, in the sense that, most of, Europe in particular and the Commonwealth are well aware of the damage that war would do if it was unleashed by Russia. We were getting quite nervous a few weeks ago that North Korea would become a target and would then release nuclear weapons, and their stockpile of nuclear weapons is minuscule compared with that's held by Russia. And rightly, the West and what used to be called Third World, so other parts of the world, will think twice, 3, 4 times before doing something that is going to get us into war. I think at the same time, the Russians are well aware of the damage that war would inflict. They, probably more than any of the Western nations, remember the Second World War. They remember the First World War, but they remember the Second World War in particular, because it's not called the National Patriotic War for nothing. They suffered huge privations, millions of deaths, and they will not forget that, and they don't want to unleash that either. So it's not as though, Putin is there saying, look, if you don't do what I tell you to do, I'm going to, unleash my nuclear weapons. Russia is far too mature a nation. It is not going to commit mass suicide by launching a war on the West. Now, you have to be careful to manage the interfaces, those points where something could break out, which could then escalate. I mean, we all know of the problems of South Korea and North Korea, and the fact that there's quite a limited area in which those interactions could happen. A border skirmish could turn into something major. The Russians are equally well aware, and I think that, we have found that from a strategic point of view, the Russians are quite happy to manipulate the United Nations when their interests demand it. But actually, if we were coming to a point where there was going to be a hot war, I think the Russians would behave alongside America, the Western European nations, Australia, to make sure that it didn't happen. It's in nobody's interests. Everybody is well aware that nuclear weapons would cause absolute annihilation. The Chinese are aware of it. The Chinese would be working in the United Nations to make sure it doesn't happen. So I don't think that we're moving inexorably towards some sort of hot war with Russia. I think that the Russians will certainly explore cyber warfare a lot more, because cyber warfare is much more deniable. I always maintained that if the Russians launched cyber warfare against what used to be called British Railways, and, suddenly trains didn't run, or they ran late, or, points were wrong, signals were wrong, everyone would assume that it's just same old, same old. They wouldn't ascribe it to cyber warfare. So that there are all sorts of things you could put, but it can cause, as we have seen with a number of viruses, it can cause chaos in the financial centres. It can cause chaos in power distribution systems. And I think that that's probably a way that they can go and just tweak it every so often to cause disruption, but not mayhem.
It's a beautiful way to show what practical power means in our era, that nuclear weapons are beyond practical power. The Russians can't go out and build bridges for everyone like the Chinese. They can't fund a massive engineering program or a new airport. But they can mess up someone's day and frighten everyone. So really, it's the most effective use of power in terms of dollars and humans imaginable. The Chinese would be in awe of that capacity to instill such a consequence for such a small action. The Americans can't ever manage to be this effective with such a small footprint. So for a country that really doesn't have enough people, can't use its natural resources effectively, can't upgrade its military fast enough, this is the ultimate way of walking with swagger.
And if Russia was involved in trying to influence the American election, by golly, haven't they done well? I mean, they have produced unpredictability into American politics.
Yeah.
Can only be in the Russians' interest.
Pat, there's another thing that I want to just extend on this whole notion. I mean, when we talk about nuclear weapons, we're talking about an umbrella which would prevent interstate war. But there is an element of warfare that the Russians seem to be excelling in the modern age. You mentioned cyber warfare, that's one theatre, but the other theatre of operations is the hybridized warfare that we saw take place in Crimea. Now, if the West has no answer, to Russian cyber attacks, nor has it a proper and adequate answer to Russian hybrid attacks, Where does the West sit in the spectrum, in the threat spectrum? Can we push back?
I think that you have to have, to do what Russia's doing, you have to have some barefaced audacity. You have to be able to announce with a solemn face, this has got nothing to do with Russia, and say it as though you believe it. We know that many of the mercenary troops, I use the term mercenaries really to mean irregulars, but of the mercenary troops that are operating in eastern Ukraine, operated in the Crimea, were actually Russian soldiers just not wearing their uniform. We know that the missile that shot down the Malaysian airliner belonged to the Russian army, was shipped across the border by the Russian army, was operated by the Russian army, possibly under control of the irregulars, but even so, and then of course went back across the border. Now we know that as fact, but the Russians can still stand up and say it's got nothing to do with us. And if they're prepared to accept that and be able to, the biggest liar on the block, probably gets the biggest shares of the goodies, then there is little we can do where we have a system that is based upon the rule of law and the fact that might is not right. And so I think that you're entirely correct in surmising that use of these irregulars and mercenaries to do your bidding, but to be totally deniable about them, is one way of threatening the West. Now, I don't actually think, although you can say in Ukraine it threatened the actual state itself, I think that as far as the Western nations are concerned, it won't threaten the West itself, but it will be an irritant. And it could be an irritant that causes death or destruction or whatever, and we'll have to see how the West is going to answer it. And it becomes very difficult.
As Ian Bremmer sort of made the point, Ukraine doesn't get to pivot. It only gets to do Russia. If it chooses otherwise, Russia will continue to intervene. But it seems the salient extension of everything we're talking about is, even if Russia cannot get on good terms with everybody, it can't be ignored by anybody. So its real power is not necessarily that it's at the table getting a share, but that everyone is concerned what it might do. So it's that critical thing that all Russian leaders need, relevance outside Russia, and that this continues their relevance, and that really we might want to look for a longer, more important game. But when all you want to do is sustain your regime, relevance is the key thing for today, tomorrow, and the day after. And 3 days from now, you reassess how to be relevant.
Yes, and I think that because decision-making at the top in Russia is really quite a small, coherent group, they can be quite agile in the way they do things. And that is quite good because it keeps the West on its toes. And it divides the West. So, you can try to pit, Macron originally came up when Theresa May had said that this was a Russian attack with nerve agents. Macron said, well, they're not quite sure, He then did change his mind. But, you could see that being used as a way of splitting up the West in terms of its coherence. And the Russians will try to do that. Because after all, it's one of the oldest ploys in the strategic gaming book.
Yeah, you don't have to conquer, you only have to divide.
That's it.
Yeah. Okay, Pat, well, I think that will be it for now. We thank you very much for your time, and we're looking forward to seeing you again back on STRATEGIKON. So it's goodbye from me, John.
It's goodbye from me, David.
Goodbye from me, Shaz.
It is.